Okay, so now we begin the even more serious part of the day. The second panel. On the second panel, I'll introduce everybody once and then I will step aside. We have Jeffrey Bale, who is currently teaches at the Graduate School of International Policy and Management at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, while also a consultant on the advisory board. Wait, the Middlebury Institute of...
Yeah, we just changed the name because Middlebury College took over the Monterey Institute of International Studies.
Oh, okay, because he actually lives in Monterey, which is a more interesting place to visit than
not in Vermont,
Middlebury. So, yes, his work is primarily concerned with issues of terrorism and ideological extremism. Jeffrey had a conference in which he gathered a bunch of millennialists, Timothy Furnish and myself included, how many years ago? 3 years ago?
I lose track of time, but it's probably something like that.
2012.
Anyway, and writes a great deal on this issue that we are at least tangentially dealing with, which is the sort of reluctance to even acknowledge, much less discuss some of the aspects of this problem. The second speaker is Cole Bunsell. Cole is a doctoral candidate at Princeton with Bernard Haeckel. Is that pronounced correctly?
Haeckel.
Haeckel. And in fact, I had invited Bernard, and he said, you must invite my graduate student, which I did, and I'm glad I did. A leading expert on ISIS, and is in fact working on a thesis about?
It touches on ISIS.
Right, on a Wahhabi thinker from the early 20th century,
Okay.
who is much cited by ISIS. And the last speaker is Timothy Furnish, who illustrates in a different way the issue that I raised about the difficulty of dealing with these topics within academia. PhD who should be teaching at a major institution and is in fact an independent scholar. And whose book on Mahdism in Sunni tradition, mostly it's viewed as a Shiite phenomenon, but he has tracked this same tradition, or a variant tradition in Sunni tradition, is a major contribution to the literature on apocalyptic Islam. And then finally, as a commentator, Charles Cameron, who is an old friend, one of the original regulars and faithful of the Center for Millennial Studies. I think you came to every conference? Pretty close.
Did you come to every conference?
Sorry?
Did you come to every conference?
The Center for Millennial Studies.
I'm still not hearing that.
Doesn't matter. I say he did.
What's that gender?
Right. He is a writer, poet, teacher, and game designer, has an amazingly broad range of intellectual interests, blogs, tweets, and probably Facebooks. I don't know about the Facebook, but I do know about the blogging and the tweeting, and everything that he puts up is interesting. He will comment at the end, and so without further ado, let the games begin.
Yeah, Richard had originally asked me to write on, or to talk about the peaceful Mahdist movements, like I mentioned briefly in my comment earlier. But I wanted to redress the lack of discussion of the Ottomans, because I think it's very important, because I think the Ottomans, besides the fact it's being historically important, maybe we can learn something from them about how to deal with these sorts of movements. Because for the Ottomans, Mahdism was not just an academic exercise. It was not just something that a few disgruntled clerics may write about or talk about. It was a movement that very often took concrete form as jihads against the Ottoman Empire. So, probably not anyone in here, but I've heard and read people that blame such things entirely on Western interference. It's really hard to blame it on Western interference when it's the Ottomans fighting them. So, although they did sometimes make things more difficult, as we'll see, particularly in Sudan with the British. So, I talked about the Ottomans. Why? As I said, perhaps we can learn something from the modern successor states of the Ottomans that are dealing with this. Maybe you can learn something. And ironically also, people like the late but not much lamented bin Laden would talk about, and his epigones today talk about the fact that the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate is a major disaster for the Islamic world, interestingly enough, on that side. And look around. A lot of talk, a lot of the papers are on the ideology itself, and people that ascribe to the apocalyptic ideology as such. We don't talk much about how to respond to them. So I just thought perhaps it might help to do that a bit. Now there's a great deal. Some of you probably know this. There's not maybe a great deal, but there's a fair amount of academic study of the issue of mutiny, what they call mutiny in the Ottoman Empire. And I guess I've just seen way too many old movies, because mutiny to me means got somebody on a ship trying to take over the ship. But that is really not what the term has come to mean in the scholarly discussion of rebellions or revolts against the Ottoman Empire. So it's sort of a term in general meaning resistance to lawful authority in the Ottoman Empire, which, by the way, I think everyone should know this, but just so you know for sure, this is a Sunni state, all right? The Ottoman Empire is officially a Sunni state. It enforces Sunni Islam, although, as we shall see, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman government, was greatly intertwined with the mystical Sufi orders. So that was a factor that could be both a positive or a negative in the empire. But anyway, back to mutinies. Mutinies are tantamount to rebellion in many ways, generally by contingents of the army and or provincial officials. And there were actual naval mutinies in the Ottoman Empire, but there's not a great deal of data, it seems, on those. Mutinies, however, and this is, well, I'll talk more about this at the end, and this is where Mahdist rebellions are different in one way. Mutinies are not aimed at generally breaking up the empire. Excuse me, they were in no way any sort of existential threat to the empire. They were a means of redressing grievances, particularly by disaffected factions within the military. And you tended to have this sort of cleavage, this dichotomy in the Ottoman Empire in military terms between the Sepahis, who were sort of the landed gentry, the knights almost in a way, and the Janissaries, the special shock troops of the Ottoman Sultan. And generally, part of what was going on was tension between these two factions within the military. Over several hundred years, it became almost a chronic issue, these sorts of rebellions. And the Ottoman the Ottoman writers will refer to them in Turkish fitne, fasad, and many of you know what these terms are. Isyan, fitna, generally more or less civil strife. Fasad, mischief in the land, some sort of disloyalty, a rebellion in general. But basically, they're all subsumed under the idea of, if you are rebelling against the Ottoman Caliph, the Ottoman Sultan Caliph, you are committing some sort of Islamic sin, clearly. But it's much more than that. It's a military problem. Now, how did the sultans respond to these? And again, I'm just going through this quickly because I'm going to get to the specifically Mahdist movements. If the mutineers are in Istanbul, sometimes within the palace itself, they would often cave. You'd get a faction, a couple hundred or 1,000 soldiers would show up and literally say, "We want someone's head," and name an official. And if the Sultan didn't have enough of a backbone, they sometimes would deliver that head to them. If they're more out in the provinces and did things like extorting taxes or just harassing the peasants, it would generally be a rhetorical response. Firmans would be issued, Ottoman official rules. And then if it continued in the provinces and became seemingly a much bigger problem, the Janissaries would be called out. So, and there's an element there of, which is not that relevant to us, but there's an element there of different kinds of ethnic groups and socioeconomic groups fighting against people in center versus periphery, that sort of thing. But I bring this up to point out that there are non-Mahdist rebellions, and this is, in final resort, this is how you deal with them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Ottoman Empire, and to some extent, the Seljuk Empire, which was around before the Ottomans, were greatly entwined with Sufi orders. The Sufi orders are developed, centuries before, and for those of you that don't know, the Sufi orders are mystical. They believe in most cases in Sharia, but they believe that you need more than that. You need a direct experience of God somehow, of Allah somehow, and that can be achieved through different ways, generally prayer, but very mystical. As I have down at the bottom, some of the major characteristics of the Sufis conducive to someone trying to claim to be, or actually claiming to be the Mahdi, are the mysticism, the idea of the kutub, the pole, the charismatic religious figure around whom the world revolves, literally. Very developed idea of baraka, charisma. Also, sort of more prosaically, the idea that you have maybe not blind obedience to the head of your Sufi order, but you have a great deal of, they have a great deal of power over you. And of course, the Sufi orders, in many ways, come with sort of a ready-made group of people that can be, perhaps I should say exploited, but a group of people who can be mobilized for something, especially, it turns out, as we see in history, if someone decides they're the Mahdi. All right, and in the Ottoman government, some of the major orders are the Bektashis, the Mevlevis, the Malawis, the Naqshbandis. And these tended to be, although there's some exceptions, these orders tended to be on good terms with the Sultan, on good terms with the government, often incorporated into not just the government but the military. The Bektashis, for example, in many times often served basically as military chaplains for the Ottomans. Those often at loggerheads tended to be, although there's an exception to this, some of the Naqshbandis did fight jihads and sometimes even Mahdist jihads, but more often you would find these other orders, these other Turk or Tariqat, the Kalandaris, whose beliefs, some of which are very similar to Twelver Shi'ism, the Wafa'is, the Malamantis. The Malamantis in particular had a strong belief in the Kutub, the Sahib al-Zaman, the Lord of Time, the Mahdi. They tended to sort of conflate these ideas, and that this person, whenever they appeared, would of course be more powerful than the Ottoman Sultanate. Of course, the necessary corollary there is that the Mahdi should have temporal, not just spiritual power, not just a spiritual Mahdi. This is why I know people tend, and Will was doing this earlier, tend to speak of the Mahdi as a savior. And I think you have to kind of carefully, I think, avoid that kind of language, because there's, whatever we think about it, I think it's freighted with a lot of Christian thought in our society. And the Mahdi doesn't do what the savior does. The Mahdi is, the Mahdi is much more of a military temporal figure rather than someone who saves you from anything. And sometimes the Malamantis, since they tended more in this direction than some of the other orders, would pretend to belong to other orders in order to avoid persecution. So, again, this is, even when the Ottoman Empire gets going and that gets kicked back by Tamerlane and then comes back and reconstitutes itself and then eventually, of course, conquers Constantinople. But Mahdism, the Sufi sheikhs and the Sufi orders were involved with the Ottoman Turks even before they set up the formal empire with Constantinople as its capital. So, just some examples. You had Baba Ilyasi Khorasani and Baba Ishaq, who were both Wafa'is, who led Turkmen, basically led the Turkmens against the Seljuks, and this is, in 1240, in the name of the Mahdi. And there's other chaps, Torlak Kamal, Boucliet Mustafa, Sheikh Badr al-Din Kalandari, who fought Mahdist war against the Ottomans. And the Byzantines, of course, thought this was a wonderful thing. And of course, by this time, the Byzantine Empire is on its last legs. There were three different chaps deeming themselves Sahib al-Zaman or Mahdi in the 16th century. One of whom, at least one of whom was helped or instigated by the Safavids, which I will talk more about in a moment. Two Naqshbandi sheikhs, as I said earlier, Naqshbandis tended to be on pretty good terms with the Ottomans, but not always, during Murad IV's reign. And then another in the 17th century. So this is early on. Now, some of these are influenced a great deal by the Safavids. So basically, the Ottomans, you could say, faced both non-state and state Mahdism. All right, they had non-state Mahdism as basically rebellions within their territories. They also, on their eastern border, after 1511, 1512, after 1501, I guess one could argue, faced a state that was committed to belief in the Mahdi, although in this case specifically the Twelver Shia Mahdi, the Safavids. And we have over 200 years of this. The Safavid movement was basically a Twelver Shia Sufi order, apocalyptic and violent even before Shah Ismail came along. Were very involved in a dawah of social justice and also of defeating the Ottomans. It was payback time basically for the Sunni murder of Hussein, is sort of the way they saw it. Maybe I'll come back to this later briefly, but they may have been influenced by some of these Zaydi ideas of the jihad concept. Zaydis are the fiber Shia, and there were also a couple of large pockets of Zaydis in Iran at this time, before most of them wound up relocating to Yemen. Ismail, the first Safavid Shah, emerged from the forest to run the jihad. And the Safavids were not exactly they could give ISIS a run for their money in terms of brutality. They were known to skewer, roast alive, and eat parts of people that had been opposed to them. And then once in power, Ismail held himself as precursor to the Mahdi, because, as Will was talking about, you get this whole idea that how do you stretch out apocalyptic time? So you can stretch it out this way. Well, I'm not really the Mahdi, but I'm the precursor. They were soundly defeated by the Ottomans at Calderon in 1514, but they continued to send, it was a long simmering border war between the two. And interestingly enough, which I'm sure some of you know, the ISIS has adopted some of this terminology, I should say. They refer to Shia as what? Safavids, right? They're Safavids. So that's interesting. But the Safavids sent agents into the empire to agitate what were called the fellow Kizilbash, other Shia and pseudo-Shia groups in the Ottoman Empire against the Ottomans, including some of the Sufis. Ottoman counter-Safavid propaganda included claims that Sultan Selim I was the Mahdi, as well as, probably more importantly, fatwas calling for the deaths of the Safavids. So we had dueling fatwas even back then, although these gentlemen look rather alike, if you ask me, but they had different views of the world. The Ottomans also faced several centuries of revolts, rebellions, fitan, by the Druze. Now the Druze are interesting. They're an offshoot of the Sevener or Ismaili Shia, probably closer in theology now to the Nusayris or the Alawis, as they've been calling themselves for a century or so. They actually deified the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakam, and there's one belief that his deputy Hamza bin Ali would appear at the end of time to destroy the non-believers and al-Hakam's divinity, and then the Druze will then run the world afterwards. So they fought the Sunni Ottomans. Now, they weren't nearly as openly Mahdist, but they're certainly in many ways an extremist Shia sect that caused great problems for the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans may have been influenced in their repression of the Druze by Ibn Taymiyyah's 14th century fatwas, which had labeled the Druze and the Nusayris, the Alawis, as murtadun, as apostates. Ottoman documents did refer to the Druze as Kizilbash, again that term for the red-headed Shia heretics that caused them problems. The Druze in turn, of course, resented the Ottomans' official stifling Sunni orthodoxy, as well as, of course, probably more than that, the taxes that were levied on them. And then sort of like when you had the Byzantines helping, some of the Sufi revolts against the Ottomans, the Western powers, in this case Venice and Tuscany, helped the Druze with funding and firearms. Yemen. The Yemeni Zaydis are fiber Shia, as Fuad Khoury points out, which I think is a wonderful typology, whereas the Twelvers believe in an occulted martyr imam, the Fivers believe in a living hero imam. So it's somewhat less eschatological in that sense, but there are reports that there had been Zaydis who claimed to be the eschatological Mahdi, and as did this chap in the 1840s. And of course, if you follow Yemen today, you know that there's arguably a convergence between Twelver Shi'ism and Fiverism, Zaydism, which may simply be a matter of the Zaydis looking for help against the Sunnis, of course. What's the main characteristic needed of the imam, the hero imam? Ilm, knowledge about religion, of course Islam, and the ability to wage jihad. Right? And there was always sort of a dynamic, as there is in a lot of the Middle East, of course, between tribal affiliation and Islam per se, but those two would tend to come together to fight against the Ottomans. The Ottomans twice tried to conquer Yemen, once in the 16th and 17th century, and again in the 19th, early 20th, running into the early 20th. Why? In order to safeguard the holy places. Initially, because the Portuguese had showed up around Africa in that area, and the Ottomans wanted to try to keep them at bay. But the Ottomans, despite in some ways really sort of trying to wage total war against the Zaydis, wound up leaving. Partly, too, I should have mentioned, part of the reason they leave then is because they're waging war in Europe, so they have to worry about the Christian forces there. They come back in the late 19th century, again, to safeguard Al-Haramain. In this case, now you have the Brits in Aden. You have the whole scramble for Africa just kicking off. The French, the British, later the Italians will be in Libya. But in terms of the Red Sea area, it's mainly the British at this point. And they also, particularly after Abdul Hamid came to power, Abdul Hamid II, you also had really sort of a resentment at the sort of the hubris of these Zaydi imams who dared to challenge the Ottoman Sultan Caliph. So the Ottomans fought the Zaydis, which was, again, not as overtly Mahdist as Twelver Shia or some of these Sufi movements were, but was certainly infused with mystical and eschatological elements. The wars, I should say, are portrayed as Shia war against illegitimate Sunni overlords. And the Zaydi clerics, the tribal sheikhs, worked together and created bands of partisans who would fight, as they saw it, primarily, they're fighting jihad against their Ottoman overlords. Rebellion or mutiny, one could maybe argue, turned into guerrilla war by the 1890s. And so you had the Ottomans fighting this, again, as I said earlier, on the basis that any rebellion against Abdul Hamid II, the Ottoman Sultan, who was very big on pan-Islam, by the way, any argument with him, any violence against him, against his forces, was a fight against Islam itself. And of course, it's labeled Baghigi Rebellion, and then also Fasad and Fitna. The bureaucratic state, the Ottoman Empire this time, of course, has been trying to modernize for some time, and at least in terms of the army, had certainly been somewhat successful in doing that. They tried things like targeted punitive repression, arrest, torture, raising crops, that sort of thing. Later switched to a sort of winning hearts and minds strategy of counterinsurgency, building schools, trying to inculcate in these schools pan-Ottomanism, which perhaps worked a bit it seems, in the Sunni areas around Sana'a, but did not work in the Zaidi highlands. And this turned again into a full-fledged guerrilla war in 1904, 1905, and by 1911 the Ottomans sort of gave up, gave the Zaidi Imam the power to appoint judges, limited exemption from taxes, the right to impose hudud punishments, in return for just promising not to rise against the Sultan and leave Mecca and Medina alone, which, and the Ottomans, by World War I, pretty much pull out. By that time, they were worrying more about the Italians in Libya. So, now the big example of this, of course, is Muhammad Ahmed, the Sudanese Mahdi. Member of the Samani, as well as one or two other orders, became convinced that he was the Mahdi, heard disembodied voices, saw visions, a prophet, Sufi sheikhs telling him that he was the Mahdi and he needed to lead a fight against the infidels, which of course included the Ottomans, because the Ottomans, sort of like the Wahhabis looked at the Ottomans, were bad Muslims, and they also allied themselves with infidel Christians from places like Britain. So, and the big thing that they did that was seen as contravening Islamic law was that they interdicted the slave trade. Under the pressure from the British, the Ottomans had started interdicting the slave trade, and many of the Muslims in Sudan made a living from the slave trade, and under the strict understanding of Islamic law, which they followed at the time, as ISIS has told us again now with the renewal of it, slavery of non-Muslims is perfectly acceptable, particularly if they aren't people of the book. So, military successes eventually convinced many Sudanese, perhaps not that he was the Mahdi, but that he was worth following. And to make a long story much shorter, the British and Turco-Egyptian troops sent against the Mahdi failed miserably. And by January of 1885, they had taken Khartoum. And the Mahdi, however, died about 5 months later, probably of malaria. But the state lasted until 1898 under his so-called Caliph Abdullahi, when the British under Kitchener came back and finally ended the issue. And there's the most recent picture of him. Now, again, this is the same Sultan that dealt with the Zaydis, Abdul Hamid. Abdul Hamid was worried about the Mahdists, mainly because he saw it. I mean, this period, the Ottomans, again, there are other examples of mutinies and rebellions I could have adduced, but like specifically the Wahhabis, but the Wahhabis really didn't have an eschatological element, so I didn't. But the Ottomans faced problems coming from the southern provinces, again, that are Islamic-based revolts of one kind or another. And the big concern for the Ottomans, of course, is they don't want to lose control of Mecca and Medina, and anything happening in Arabia or Yemen would tend to threaten that. And once the Sudanese Mahdist, or the Sudanese Mahdiya, had been extended over to the Red Sea coast, then it became a concern for the Ottomans in particular that they might wind up crossing over into Arabia. But the Sultan refused to send actual Ottoman troops from Istanbul. They used Turco-Egyptian troops, mainly from Egypt, of course, and then they, working with the British, or having their arms twisted by the British, depending on how you want to interpret that, wound up sending General Charles Gordon there, who looked amazingly like Charlton Heston, in case you don't know. If you've not seen the movie Khartoum, buy it for $5 at the grocery store and watch it. It's one of the worst roles Olivier ever did. unfortunately. But, and that movie sort of epitomizes a lot of the scholarship in the past on this movement, which was just looking at it from a British point of view. I don't think they ever mentioned the Ottoman Empire in that movie. But how did they deal with Muhammad Ahmed? Okay, he first said that he had first started telling people publicly that he was the Mahdi in 1881, sometime in 1881. First, they sent a religious delegation to sort of talk him down. Sort of, you're not really the Mahdi. Then that didn't work. Then they sent, of course, then they went more kinetic, as those anywhere in the army would say. They went more kinetic. They went from soft to hard power. That didn't work either. And throughout this, they also engaged in information operations or information warfare, if you will, against the Sudanese Mahdi. Newspapers were ordered to write anti-Mahdist articles. Excuse me. The Ottoman Egyptian and the Ottoman Sudanese clerics were told to compose, publish, and distribute fatwas explaining why he's not the Mahdi. It didn't really work, but that's what they tried. And of course, eventually Gordon wound up in Khartoum, and along with a lot of other people died. Specific elements of this, and again, this is all religious stuff that the Ottoman Empire is having officially put out. You're not the Mahdi, and there's the list, all right? The Mahdi would be from Arabia, not Sudan. He'd be an Arab, not a black African. If you're the Mahdi, we're Jesus and the Dajjal. The Mahdi doesn't kill other Muslims. The Mahdi would fix Fatan. Well, the Ottoman Sultan was already doing that. You're undermining peace and stability. Mecca would be the site of Bayah for the Mahdi, or to the Mahdi, I should say, not Sudan, and so on and so forth. I mean, there really is, one could argue there's really sort of a racial element in this, but it's the Ottomans, so. Mahdi would not be self-validated via visions and dreams, right? So, but he's winning, and he's supremely convinced he is, so he's not going to listen to this. I think there's a little bit of follow-on with this, particularly I just want to mention briefly Libya, because the Sanusiya order, the Sanusi Sufi order in Libya, was suspected. They did have a sheikh called Muhammad al-Mahdi. There were Muhammad Ahmed in Sudan had sent some letters out trying to get other Islamic leaders to accept him as Mahdi, and one of them they sent was the Sanusis. They didn't, but the Ottomans were always worried about that, so they tried to make sure and sort of co-opt in a way what's going on in Libya so that this sort of idea didn't spread to Libya. And I don't know, I tried to sort of take Richard's categories from his book and try to look at some of these chaps, and I'm not sure how well some of these work, but I tried. The disparate Sufi Mahdis, I think you can see, is narcissistic. The Safavids were certainly enraged, especially against the Ottomans. The Druze, in many ways, metaphysical. The Zaydis were egalitarian. I really want to call the Sudanese narcissistic again, but I decided to call them opportunistic. And the Sanusis are sort of late millennialists. And briefly, the Mahdist rebellions are sort of like the peasant revolts of medieval Europe, in some ways, with the super added eschatology or mysticism. But again, these aren't just fellahin, these aren't just, the leadership of these movements are not uneducated. They certainly are educated. And looking at the three levels of Blichfeld, he identifies three different levels that Mahdist movements get to. I think the Ottomans had success only against groups that had not reached level 3. ISIS is at level 3 now and has territory, although ISIS is not openly proclaimed someone's the Mahdi. They're certainly eschatological, as Graham and everyone talked about. And I would just briefly say at the end here, I think the opponents are still not taking seriously the need to delegitimize ISIS, as the Ottomans did with their Mahdist opponents, seriously. Just saying they aren't Muslim does not delegitimize them. That just doesn't get the trick done. You need to refute these guys line by line. And in fact, in one of the Dabiq magazines, I forget which one because they all run together in my head, ISIS called for Mubahala, which is basically sort of you know, an Islamic challenge to another Islamic authority for Allah to decide who's right. And I think maybe that it would probably be a good idea, at least worth considering, that some of the Islamic opponents take ISIS up on that. So, all right, thank you.